Hello, this is VOW, Voices of Wisdom, the show that might not be for everybody, but everybody needs to watch this show. Today is going to be a very, very special conversation. I entitled this show Raw Talk, and I'm going to start with a quote by James Baldwin. He says, "If you avoid reality, how can you face it?" My very, very special guest today is Dr. Pamela Lottenberg. And I'm just going to read this because I think it's very important to hear who she is. Dr. Pam Lottenberg is a psychotherapist and executive organizational coach based in New York City. Pam has been engaged in anti racist leadership, coaching, and consulting to help executive leaders understand and identify the impact of structural racism and its effects, and their organizations and themselves for more than a whole decade. So, we're going to have a great show today. Check this. Her own development as a racially aware white person began more than 30 years ago. She has been on an intentional path to understand the generality of whiteness and structural racism in our country and to undo the damage from this. That's key right there. Her coaching privileges this. It is often with white leaders to help them recognize their own barriers to growth and change as future anti racist leaders, both personally and in their organizations. She is grateful to the many mentors and teachers who have helped groom her along the way. The work of undoing racism has been an integral part of Pam's identity and path. It is among her most gratifying pursuits. I'm almost speechless. As we shared actually before we started, this is sort of a challenging and a difficult conversation. But you're the person, you're the one. So tell me a little bit about your background and why you decided to do this.
So it wasn't really a decision
Hmm.
per se. Um, I was training as a clinical social worker, and I had many teachers who, who really began to identify in our nonprofit organizational world where I worked in mental health in New York City since the early 90s, how racially organized it was. They were. How central whiteness was in leadership, philosophy, and in terms of organizing the culture of the places that I found myself working. And part of social work education is about understanding marginalized populations, groups of people who are disenfranchised or discriminated against. Oppressions is a big part of the learning. So I had one, I'm going to shout out to Mary Pender Green, one of the most known, networked, beloved teachers, leaders of in the nonprofit sector in New York City, mental health social service sector, African American woman who started to bring change to the nonprofit world in New York City by identifying a need to sort of find a language to explain what was really happening. The structurally embedded racist infrastructure systems that influenced how we worked, how we hired, how we worked with clients, and the invisibility the invisibility of race in that world and in that context. And Mary has, for the past 30 years, lifted up New York City's social work, mental health, social service world and brought a kind of knowledge, training to our profession and our city and beyond. And so she's been an incredible influence. And she was talking and I was listening. And I started to appreciate she was identifying what most white people had never been really deeply aware of, educated about, steeped in knowing and working to get to know more. So in that sense, it wasn't necessarily a decision, it was a thing that happened. And, you know, I was primed for it probably because my parents moved my family to an intentionally integrated community in the 60s in northern New Jersey. And so already I was growing up in a context of a real diverse community of friends and friend groups and families. And even where there were sort of racial segregated sort of dynamics in the town, you know, in the school system, we all came together. And so in a way, that was part of my training to bring me to have the openness to say, that's what's going on when Mary started to really flesh out 30 years ago. You know, we were talking about multiculturalism, then we were talking about diversity in organizations, then we were talking about, you know, making sure that the organization reflected the clientele that we were serving, and then we were starting to talk about the systemic racism embedded that generates and continues to generate oppressions, and so on and so on and so on, until we're up to, you could say, really appreciating implicit bias, white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, what's behind the veil in Black communities that whites have not been trained in. So that's a big intro to who I am and how I think and what I've learned and how I've been part of a consulting group, you could say, is one of the things I do, which goes into nonprofit organizations in New York and works to decenter whiteness and help people really see and understand the institutional racism. My role has particularly been to be an executive coach and consultant to white leaders, CEOs, executive leaders, to really help them begin the journey that I was just telling you that I was on and learned from.
But you know, I'm glad you went there because I recall we had someone come in to where I used to work in the village in Southampton. And the thing that I noticed was not everybody was listening. Not everybody was really paying attention. Not everybody even wanted to be there. So I'm sure maybe a small percentage of people, maybe one or two people really got something out of it. But what do you do, or how do you move forward, or how do you, when you're up doing that, do you notice that usually people are mandated sometimes to be at these meetings or be at these sessions. So sometimes people just don't really want to even be there. So how do you manage that? Do you call them out? Do you just continue to do what you do? Do you have like a follow-up of coming back with what's going to happen or what should have happened?
So the way I try to work with people is I try to sort of take the temperature of what it feels like to be doing it in the here and now. So if I felt like you weren't involved in this conversation with me, or if you felt I wasn't really present, I would hope that one of us would say to each other, so where are you? Like, are you okay? Can you be here? Can you bring yourself here? What are the obstacles? What are the barriers? How come? What are you worried about? And I would really just start with that. So if I felt like I know what you mean. There's a lot of like, especially now because society is a little bit more woke, but it doesn't mean that that people are coming along with that wokeness, right? It means that people are showing up because diversity training or inclusion and equity is part of the curriculum or it's part of the mandate in your organizations or government programs. but people are showing up and just sort of sitting there and not engaging. So my question would be like, how come? What are you worried about? And sometimes as a white person doing that training, and I think Mary's credit, Mary Pendergreen, who I mentioned before, who's just so wise. She's been my most important mentor and teacher. She's like, white people have to talk to white people. White people have to do the talking because folks of color have been on that hot seat talking for all this time. And not only do we have white folks in the audiences feeling like they've never really had to pay attention to the experience of folks of color or what race issues feel like and look like, so they're tuned out because they've always been tuned out. But we also think of it like it's time for for white folks to do the work because we created the problem, right? So we are like societally, we create and we perpetuate a great deal of the problem. So some of your viewers are going to say, well, what about, folks of color or black folks who are also part of the problem? Everybody's got a role in this.
Exactly.
I don't want to let people off the hook, but what we have to start with is knowing that white people created a system in this United States of America, going back to once upon a time when folks of color had 3/4 of a count as a human being and a citizen. And if you, or not even a citizen, the fight for citizenship didn't resolve until the 60s, I think. I'm not a historian. But what I'm trying to say about that is if folks don't understand that that doesn't have a legacy, have a coattail, take a lot to undo. And that's what I meant when in my bio when I say undoing racism. I'm elaborating this. I think about this every day in my professional life, in my personal life, when I'm walking down the street. I notice the microaggressions that white people don't even notice. And so it's time for white people to help white people see what they can't see, they've never been asked to see, and their life hasn't been marginalized to have to be forced into seeing.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's funny because I remember when we had this conversation beginning, why so glad that you agreed to be on the show, is the question was asked to me, and this is what I shared with you when we had that first conversation was, I think it was the I Am Not Okay film, and someone said to me, so they're very compassionate about it, and they want to say, well, what should white people do? And I very bluntly said, you should speak up, because that's the part that I do seem and have experienced. So many white people are very compassionate, and especially after the George Floyd thing. That was like,
woke people up.
We're going to go there a little bit more too. But they sit back and have this, resentment, not resentment, that's not the word I want to use, this pushback or this step back of not wanting to say anything because maybe it might call them out or might take away some economic way or whatever. So my thing was so important to say, speak up. Because like you said, Pam, we've been trying to say this for much too long.
Right.
And that's why I've come to the place that I think it's time for white people to speak up. And so you have basically said it all. We almost can stop the show right now, but we continue because the other part I want to mention and elaborate on is something else you said is the legacy of the pain that we have. This tears again.
I think the tears make sense. Why hold them back? I mean, I know you're on TV, but white people need to see the tears.
The legacy of pain that we as Black people have gone through, from being taken away from Africa, being enslaved, being lynched, being hung in front of their own families, being taken away, the family split up. I mean, we can go on, we can even talk about how, they finally got freed, emancipation, but then we had Jim Crow. We had all these laws and all these things put in place to what? To keep them keep white people empowered. And I mean, it's still happening. I mean, we talk about they talk about the statistics of how many young Black boys have been killed by the police. I mean, the thing that I have to say, getting back to George Floyd, I could not watch it. I was away. I was out of the country at the time when it all happened. I could not watch it. The only time I finally watched the whole thing was when the gentleman was on trial. And I'm a frustrated attorney. I was going one time to be an attorney, so I love this court stuff. So I did really watch that. That's the first time that I saw the whole thing because I couldn't watch it. I couldn't watch it.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I was hoping this didn't happen today. The other thing that I can't help to think about, and I've shared this before on a show, I was maybe 7, 8 years old, and I was watching cartoons, sitting on the floor, the black and white TV. You're gonna tell how old I am now. And watching cartoons, eating my cereal, and all of a sudden, you know how they interrupt the show, and I happen to look up, and what I see is these police officers. It was in the '60s, so it was during the civil rights. These police officers with these batons beating people with these dogs chasing. Then they had the water hose. You see people flying across the street, flying up against buildings. And I never forget. I mean, I'm older now, but I can go every time I talk about this. I go right back to being on that floor in front of that television, and well, let me get this out. And I remember saying, "Oh my God, the police officers was right in our classroom, and they said they're going to protect us." And those people look just like us. So they could do it to my mom and my dad. So what do you say about when people are not understanding what we're still going through and the trauma that has been passed on? And then they call us sometimes angry black women. They call, they say, they stereotype all these different things like we're not supposed to be angry and what the hell has happened to us. So what is your response to that?
First of all, I'm angry.
Okay.
I'm angry. And I don't know that I'll ever not feel angry about what happened, everything you just said. And people who say, and there are people out there who say, can't you just get over it? That was old history. Well, think about where your ancestors come from, viewer. Think about what your ancestry has come through. And a lot of white people say, yeah, but look at what my ancestors were able to build of themselves. And what I would say to that is your ancestors came to a country that was established and set up to assure that the whiteness of your ancestor was going to have access, opportunity, and support to thrive in a way that was never intended or remedied even in this country for folks of color, for the Black African diaspora that came, that was brought, that was stolen, that was kidnapped and brought to this country and enslaved. And it's not an equal playing field. That's what equity means for your white audience. Equity implies that people have the same sort of conditions to thrive from.
Exactly.
And the conditions were not the same. Folks of color didn't have opportunity, didn't have encouragement. If anything, like you said, they had race-based rules to discriminate and disempower, disenfranchise, and frankly, terrorize,
Exactly.
AKA Jim Crow laws.
Absolutely.
And that didn't end in the civil rights, era. You describe coming up from your playtime, your mealtime, to watch a TV episode of what still was happening, which was the brutal, disempowering of, the attempt to dismantle and disempower the voices of folks of color, Black folks who were standing up and trying to make a point. The point is very well taken. So what I say is, I'm getting a little long-winded there, but white folks have to remember they came to a country, their ancestors came to a country that wanted them to thrive. It wasn't the same for folks of color. And the opportunity for thriving came with civil rights achievements like affirmative action, right? Finally, how do you make sure that folks of color who didn't have wealth legacy, right, money that they could start generating from the time their ancestor came to this country, because the white government was designing a society for white people to be more successful and have that kind of economic opportunity. So there's cash in the bank for generations now. And so affirmative action is a way to remedy the fact that there wasn't maybe the kind of wealth that would support communities to have better education, to have more successful entree into colleges, certain colleges, and so on and so on. I mean, to me, it's so obvious, it's almost embarrassing to have to restate it. But I know that I have been paying attention for 30 years and really see what this is about. And so when you ask, what do you say to that? I understand intergenerational transmission of trauma. We all have it on some level from something about our youth. And we have these flashbulb memories.
Absolutely.
The classic example is once upon a time people used to say, where were you when Kennedy was shot?
Exactly.
And then now we say, where were you when on 9/11? And everybody remembers like a crystal clear snapshot. And so why would people think that it's not the same intergenerationally for people who were brought to this country enslaved?
You know, it's so funny. I think about this whole saying, you need to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I can't help but think about Black Wall Street.
Right.
They had everything that they wanted. They said, we don't, we're going to do what we need to do. We got our banks, we got our schools, we have everything. And then they're going to come in and destroy everything. And I have to say this is something that I have never said out loud. But I remember going back at all this history and looking at all this history. And all of a sudden, I heard myself say this: what kind of evil is this? That's what came to me. And I'm like, I've been in a place now, where I'm trying to balance out how I feel. I don't want to ever say I hate white people, because I don't. Because I found some wonderful people like yourself and a lot of other wonderful people. So I never want to, I fight with that. We're doing a raw talk today. I fight with that. I fight with it. And I continue to, I guess, reference back because of the love I have in my heart. I'm a love person. And I find sometime when I start feeling this thing, it's not who I am. And then I have to like shake it off and just regroup and say, okay, gotta look at this another way, Brenda. Gotta look at this another way, But after a while, it's hard. You keep brushing it off. You keep trying to keep it. But at this point now, that's why I'm glad you're here today. I'm glad that you had the balls, I'm going to say it, to do this with me today. And I just really hope that people will look at this show, listen to what Pam has said as a white person. And we have about a minute and a half left, and I want you to have the last say.
The only thing I want to add is white
I
people.
think this is your camera if you want to look at that.
White people are good people very often and well-intended. What I think they don't know and could do, make a big impact, is speaking up. But speaking up because they understand that they may not be racist in their acts towards their neighbors and friends and loved ones. But the society is set up so that they're participating in a structurally, systemically racist infrastructure. So unless you do something about that, you can be the nicest person in the world, but unless you hold awareness of that and work to remedy that and speak up, so you're not just saying, I don't have to do anything here because it doesn't really affect me. Unless you do that, of course you're going to feel angry at those white folks and wonder, like, are they with me? Are they doing anything? Are they ever going to show up? And this is how I believe we show up. You could be a good person, but if you're not dealing with the fact that we're all sitting on this foundation stone that is unequal, out of balance, and unless you know that you have to do something to balance it better, you're not going to be doing anything. And hence, anger will persist. Why wouldn't it? If I was on fire and nobody came to my rescue, I'd be angry.
Pam, I just want to again say thank you. Thank you
You're so welcome,
for
Brenda.
coming on the show
You're so welcome.
and sharing this raw talk. I
You bet.
appreciate you.
I appreciate you. I'm happy I could be here. It's like, it means the world to me to get the word out.
Thank you. This has been Brenda Simmons, VOW Voices of Wisdom. Have a wonderful day.